The sea does not keep secrets. It buries them beneath the crushing, silent, and eternal weight of its dark, cold water. It holds the stories of countless voyages. It guards the memories of triumphs and tragedies, of fortunes made and lives lost, of brave departures and silent, unheralded returns to the deep. For millennia, we have been drawn to the ocean, venturing out upon its vast, indifferent, and often violent surface in vessels of wood, iron, and steel. Each ship that leaves the safety of the harbor is a world unto itself, a self-contained, floating society with its own rigid rules, its own unwritten codes, its own fragile hierarchies, and its own volatile chemistry of human souls, all bound together in a fragile bubble of civilization upon an abyss of raw, untamable chaos. And sometimes, for reasons we may never know, that bubble pops. Sometimes, the entire world of the ship is swallowed whole, leaving behind nothing but a name in a dusty ledger and a lingering, unanswered, and often unanswerable question. But there is a specific kind of maritime mystery that is, in a way, even more unsettling, more profoundly disturbing than a ship simply lost to a storm. It is the mystery of the ghost ship. And I'm not talking about a spectral, glowing galleon with tattered sails, crewed by phantom pirates, the stuff of legend, cinema, and folklore. I'm talking about something far more real, far more tangible, and therefore far more terrifying. A physical, modern vessel, a massive and complex machine of commerce, discovered adrift or aground, completely, utterly, and inexplicably empty. The ship is there, a solid physical fact. But its soul, its human heart, its crew, has been surgically, silently ripped from it, leaving behind a silent, floating tomb. It is a mystery that doesn't just ask what happened to the ship, but poses the far more chilling question: where did everyone go? Tonight, we set sail into the heart of one of the greatest, most enduring, and most officially investigated unsolved ship mysteries in American history. It is the story of a majestic, five-masted schooner, a true titan of the final, glorious twilight of the age of sail, found hard aground on the treacherous, ship-eating shoals of North Carolina's Outer Banks. Her sails were still set, her anchors were gone, and she looked as if she had been deliberately, almost perfectly, sailed onto her own granite tombstone. But when the rescue crews, after days of battling violent seas, finally managed to board her, they found a scene of profound and eerie desolation that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The entire crew of 11 men had vanished from the face of the earth. There were no signs of violence, no bodies, no blood, no evidence of a struggle. There was only a meal, left half-prepared in the galley, as if the cook had been interrupted mid-chop. Personal belongings, valuable navigation equipment, and the ship's vital logbook were all gone. And in the eerie, wind-whipped silence of the dead ship, there was but one sign of life, a final, surrealistic touch to an already impossible scene. A single, hungry, but otherwise content, six-toed cat. This is the story of the Carol A. Deering. It is a case so baffling, so strange, and so full of conflicting and contradictory clues that it launched one of the largest and most wide-ranging maritime investigations in U.S. history, an inquiry that would eventually involve no fewer than 6 different departments of the United States government. It is a story of a troubled voyage, a resentful and hard-drinking first mate, a captain who openly feared for his life, and a cryptic final message shouted from a passing ship through a megaphone. It's a mystery that has been blamed on everything from a bloody mutiny and ruthless piracy to devastating hurricanes and international Bolshevik conspiracies. And it is, without a doubt, a cornerstone case in the dark and enduring legend of a place we now know as the Bermuda Triangle. So come aboard, light a lamp against the gathering fog, as we attempt to piece together the final, fateful, and ultimately lost voyage of America's most famous ghost ship. Our story begins not on the windswept expanse of the open ocean, but in the noisy, industrious shipyards of Bath, Maine, in the year 1919. This was a transitional, almost schizophrenic era for maritime commerce and technology. The age of steam had long since conquered the seas, with massive, smoke-belching, steel-hulled freighters dominating the major international shipping lanes. But the age of sail, the romantic era of towering wooden masts and billowing white canvas, was not quite dead. It was in its twilight, but it was a glorious and powerful twilight. The recent conclusion of World War I had created a massive, unprecedented demand for shipping of all kinds, and many companies, especially those involved in the coastal trade of bulk goods like coal and lumber, found that large, modern, and efficiently rigged sailing vessels were still highly efficient and immensely profitable. They were cheaper to build, cheaper to operate, and didn't rely on expensive and sometimes scarce fuel. And there were few vessels more modern, more efficient, or more magnificent than the Carroll A. Deering. She was a schooner, but not the quaint two-masted vessel that word might conjure in your mind. She was a colossal five-masted fore-and-aft schooner, a true cathedral of wood and canvas, a masterpiece of naval architecture. At 255 feet long, with a beam of over 44 feet, she was one of the last great commercial sailing ships ever built in the United States. She was the property of the G.G. Deering Company, a respected and highly successful shipbuilding firm based in Maine, owned and operated by the Deering family. They didn't just build ships. They operated a fleet of them, and they had a sterling reputation for quality, craftsmanship, and reliability. The Carroll A. Deering, named for the son of the company's founder, was their crown jewel, a powerful and beautiful testament to a dying but still proud American tradition. In the summer of 1920, the Deering was chartered for what should have been a routine but highly lucrative voyage. The plan was simple and straightforward, a journey she had made before. She was to sail from the bustling port of Norfolk, Virginia, to the vibrant city of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with a full cargo of over 3,000 tons of high-grade American coal. From there, after unloading her cargo, she was to sail north, likely stopping in Barbados for supplies and new orders, before returning to the east coast of the United States to collect her payment and begin the cycle anew. The man chosen to command this important voyage was Captain William H. Merritt. At 66 years old, he was a veteran mariner of the old school, a man who had spent his life on the decks of sailing ships. He was known as a trusted, reliable, by-the-book captain, and his son, Sewell Merritt, a capable sailor in his own right, was to serve as his first mate. It was a family affair, a solid, experienced, and trustworthy command structure for a long and challenging journey. In late August of 1920, the Carroll A. Deering, with her hand-picked crew of 10 men, her holds full of coal, set sail from Norfolk. And almost immediately, the voyage was cursed. Before the ship had even cleared the coast of Delaware, Captain Merritt, the steady hand at the helm, fell gravely, suddenly, and mysteriously ill. The exact nature of his illness was never specified, but it was severe enough that he was completely incapacitated, in no condition to command a ship on a months-long voyage to South America. The ship was forced to put into the small port of Lewis, Delaware, where the ailing Captain Merritt and his son, the first mate who would not leave his father's side, had to disembark. In an instant, the Deering was left without a captain or a first officer. This was a major and very expensive problem for the G.G. Deering Company. The ship was fully loaded, the crew was waiting, the charter was active, and every single day spent idle in port was costing them a significant amount of money. They had to find a replacement command crew, and they had to do it fast. The company scrambled, sending telegrams and making frantic phone calls up and down the East Coast, looking for any qualified officers who were available on short notice. For the role of captain, they managed to hire another 66-year-old retired sea captain named Willis T. Wormel. Like Merritt, Wormel was a veteran of the age of sail, a man with decades of experience under his belt. He was well respected, if perhaps a little rusty from his recent time on shore. He seemed like a solid, if hastily chosen, replacement, a safe pair of hands. But the real problem, the fateful decision that would sow the seeds of discord and potential disaster for the entire voyage, was the company's choice for the new first mate. They hired a man named Charles E. McClellan. And Charles McClellan was trouble. He was known up and down the coast as a capable and skilled sailor, a man who knew his craft. But he was also known as a heavy drinker, a chronic malcontent, and a man with a serious, simmering authority problem. Compounding this already volatile mix, it was later revealed that McClellan held a deep and intensely personal grudge against his new captain, Willis Wormel. McClellan had apparently once applied for a command of his own, and he believed, rightly or wrongly, that it was Captain Wormel who had given him a bad reference, a black mark on his record that had cost him the job. McClellan felt that Wormel had personally sabotaged his career. So now, the new command structure of the Carroll A. Deering was a toxic, volatile cocktail of resentment and mistrust. You had an elderly, stern, by-the-book captain, pulled out of retirement, who expected iron discipline and absolute order. And you had a younger, resentful, and hard-drinking first mate who believed that very captain was the reason for his professional failures. The potential for conflict was immense. One of McClellan's friends would later tell investigators that before the voyage began, McClellan had been heard openly boasting in a waterfront bar that he was going to get the captain during the trip. It was a chilling piece of foreshadowing, a threat that hung in the air over the ship before she even left the dock. Despite this simmering, unspoken tension, the voyage began anew. On September 8, 1920, with Captain Wormel in command, McClellan as his resentful second, and a newly assembled crew comprised mostly of Scandinavian sailors, who may not have even spoken the same language as their officers, the Carroll A. Deering finally left Delaware for Rio de Janeiro. The long journey south across the equator was likely a tense and unhappy one. We have no direct record of it, as the ship's log would later vanish, but we can imagine the daily friction, the cold silences, the arguments whispered just out of earshot. The ship arrived in Rio without major incident, but it was there, in the Libertine port city, that the conflict between Captain Wormel and First Mate McClellan exploded into the open, for all to see. McClellan, finally free from the confines and discipline of the ship, went on a spectacular drinking binge. He got into trouble with the local authorities and was promptly arrested. The dignified Captain Wormel was forced to go ashore and personally bail his insubordinate drunkard of a first mate out of a Brazilian jail. Wormel was, by all accounts, livid. His authority had been publicly undermined, and his first mate was proving to be completely and dangerously unreliable. While still in Rio, Wormel happened to meet with an old friend, a fellow sea captain named Goodwin, who was commanding another American vessel in the harbor. Wormel, a man not known for complaining, unburdened himself to his friend in a rare display of vulnerability and fear. He complained bitterly about McClellan, calling him a drunken bum and a scoundrel, and stating unequivocally that he could not trust him. He went even further, expressing a genuine and profound fear for his own personal safety. He told Captain Goodwin that, with McClellan aboard, he was afraid to even attempt the long, isolated voyage home. He felt he needed to fire McClellan and replace him, but finding a qualified first mate in Rio on short notice was proving to be impossible. He was trapped. He was being forced to sail thousands of miles with a man he believed hated him and was capable of violence. On December 2, 1920, his fears still raw and his options exhausted, Captain Wormel gave the reluctant order to set sail from Rio. He had lodged his official complaints with the shipping agent, but he was stuck with his crew, stuck with McClellan, for the long journey back to North America. The Carroll A. Deering pointed her bow north, her 5 majestic masts catching the southern trade winds, a ship sailing into a gathering storm, carrying a cargo of coal and a heavy, explosive weight of bad blood. The first indication that something was seriously wrong with the Deering's return voyage came in early January of 1921. The ship's intended and scheduled route was to sail from Rio to the island of Barbados, a common stop for vessels on this route to take on fresh water and supplies, and, most importantly, to receive new orders from the company for their final destination. But the Carol A. Deering never arrived in Barbados. She sailed right past the island, continuing north without stopping, without making contact. This was a major and very strange deviation from the plan. Why would a ship on a long and arduous voyage bypass a scheduled and necessary port of call? Was there a problem on board so severe that they couldn't risk putting into a busy, populated port? Or, in a more sinister interpretation, was someone else now in command of the ship, someone with a different, undeclared destination in mind? The ship remained silent and unseen for several more weeks, a ghost on the water. Then, on January 23, 1921, she reappeared off the coast of North Carolina. She was sighted by the crew of the Cape Lookout lightship, a vessel anchored permanently off the coast to serve as a floating lighthouse and navigational aid. The keeper of the lightship, Captain Jacobson, a man who had seen thousands of ships pass, and he was immediately struck by how strange the Deering looked and behaved. For one, she was sailing unusually and dangerously close to the treacherous shoals that lined the coast. But more disturbingly, he noted in his own log that the crew seemed to be milling about on the quarterdeck. The quarterdeck was the sacred space of a sailing ship, the area usually reserved for the captain and his officers. For the common crew to be congregating there was a serious, almost unthinkable breach of shipboard discipline, and it strongly suggested that the normal, rigid chain of command had completely broken down. It was another bright red flag, a clear signal of chaos and disorder aboard the vessel. 5 days later, on the afternoon of January 28th, the Carol A. Deering was sighted again, this time by the keeper of the lightship at Cape Fear. She sailed close and hailed the lightship. A crewman, using a megaphone to be heard over the wind and waves, shouted across the water. But the man shouting was not the 66-year-old Captain Wormel. He was described by the lightship keeper as a thin man with reddish hair. He yelled that the Deering had lost both of her heavy bower anchors in a storm somewhere off Cape Fear. This was a very serious problem, leaving the massive ship essentially unable to stop, to moor, or to secure itself in any way. The man on the Deering asked the lightship keeper to report their predicament to their company, the G.G. Deering Company in Maine. The keeper, a man named Captain Thomas, agreed to do so. But as the Deering sailed on, fading into the distance, Captain Thomas discovered that his radio was out of order. He couldn't send the message. This brief, shouted exchange was the last known human contact with anyone aboard the Carol A. Deering. The ship, now anchorless and with a strange, unidentified man apparently at the helm, continued on its northward course, sailing directly towards the most treacherous and feared stretch of water on the entire Atlantic seaboard, the Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras. The Diamond Shoals are infamous among mariners. It is a shifting, shallow, and relentlessly violent graveyard of submerged and ever-changing sandbars that extends for miles out into the open ocean. It is a place where the cold Labrador current collides with the warm Gulf Stream, creating chaotic, unpredictable seas and hurricane-force winds. It is a place where countless ships, for centuries, have met their end, earning the region the grim and well-deserved nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. It is a place that any experienced sailor, in any vessel, would give a very, very wide berth. But in the pre-dawn darkness of January 31st, 1921, the Carol A. Deering did the unthinkable. With her sails still set, she sailed directly onto the shoals. running hard aground with a sound that must have been like the world's largest dying groan. The first to see her were the surfmen from the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard station. As the sun rose on that cold January morning, they were confronted with the stunning and horrifying sight of the massive five-masted schooner, sitting bolt upright on the sandbars, her sails still fully, beautifully set, being relentlessly, brutally pounded by the violent surf. She looked like a magnificent beast that had been deliberately, almost sacrificially, led to slaughter. An immediate rescue attempt was impossible. The seas were far too rough, a churning maelstrom of white water. For 4 long days, the Coast Guard and the locals who gathered on the shore could only watch as the magnificent vessel was slowly, inexorably beaten apart by the waves. They watched through their telescopes, and they waited, seeing no signs of life, no distress signals, no flares, no attempt by a crew to save themselves or to launch the lifeboats. There was only a profound and terrifying silence from the dying ship. Finally, on February 4th, after 4 days of this relentless punishment, the sea calmed just enough for a brave boarding party to make the treacherous journey out to the wreck. What they found has become the stuff of maritime legend. It was a scene of profound and eerie desolation, a perfect, chilling portrait of a world interrupted. They climbed aboard the battered, groaning schooner and were met with a deafening, unnatural silence, broken only by the cry of gulls and the groan of tortured wood. The ship was completely, utterly deserted. The entire crew of 11 men, Captain Wormel, the resentful first mate McClellan, and the 9 Scandinavian sailors had vanished without a trace. As the boarding party moved cautiously through the silent, waterlogged vessel, the mystery only deepened and the contradictions multiplied. In the ship's galley, they found a meal being prepared. Food was still out on the cutting boards, vegetables half-chopped. Pots were still on the stove. It was as if the ship's cook had been interrupted mid-task and had simply walked away, expecting to return in a moment. This single, powerful detail strongly suggested that the abandonment of the ship had been sudden, panicked, and unplanned. But other clues found on the ship suggested the exact opposite. All of the ship's most valuable and essential navigation equipment, the chronometer, the sextants, the captain's logbooks, were gone. The ship's official papers and the crew's personal belongings from their quarters were also missing. And, most importantly, the ship's 2 heavy lifeboats were gone from their davits. This suggested a deliberate, orderly, and planned abandonment of the vessel. It was a maddening, impossible contradiction. Was the abandonment a sudden, panicked flight, or was it a planned, orderly departure? The evidence seemed to scream both at once. There were other strange and disturbing discoveries. The ship's steering system was found to be damaged, with parts of the gear smashed and inoperable, though it was impossible to tell if this was damage from the storm, the result of the grounding, or an act of deliberate sabotage. Charts were found strewn about the captain's cabin, but strangely, they were not for the waters of North Carolina, but for areas much further south. It was as if the ship had been sailing blind, without proper guidance, for some time. Crucially, there were no signs of a struggle. No bloodstains, no bullet holes, no axe marks in the woodwork, no evidence of a fire or a violent confrontation of any kind. It was simply empty, a hollowed-out giant, its soul ripped away, leaving only a wooden corpse. And then there was the final, haunting, surrealistic detail. Amidst the desolation and the silence, the boarding party found one living thing. Huddled in the galley, hungry but otherwise completely unharmed, was a single 6-toed cat. The presence of the cat only added to the profound mystery. If the crew had abandoned ship in the lifeboats, why would they leave behind the ship's pet? A creature sailors are notoriously superstitious about and fond of? It was a small, but deeply unsettling, piece of an already impossible puzzle. The news of the ghost ship on Diamond Shoals became an immediate national sensation. The story of the Carol A. Deering was a perfect mystery, tailor-made for the front pages of the newspapers. The public was utterly captivated. Where had the crew gone? What had happened on that long, troubled voyage from Rio? The pressure for answers was immense, and the United States government responded with an official investigation of unprecedented scale and scope. No fewer than 5 and later a 6th different government departments were brought in to solve the mystery. The Department of Commerce, which oversaw shipping, the Treasury Department, which oversaw the Coast Guard, the Department of Justice, which brought in the fledgling Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner to the FBI, the Navy Department, which provided intelligence and resources, and the State Department, which investigated the international angles. This was not just a simple maritime inquiry. It was a full-blown, top-level federal investigation, a testament to how seriously this mystery was taken at the highest levels of power. The small army of investigators was faced with a maddening array of possibilities, a maelstrom of competing theories, each of which seemed plausible on its surface, and each of which had significant, often fatal, flaws. Let's examine the primary suspects in the court of inquiry. The first, and for a long time the leading theory, was mutiny. The evidence for this was compelling and circumstantial. The investigation quickly uncovered the deep and poisonous animosity between Captain Wormell and First Mate McClellan. McClellan's alleged threats to get the captain before the voyage even started were taken very seriously. The theory went something like this. McClellan, a man stewing in resentment and likely fueled by alcohol, finally made his move sometime after leaving Rio, perhaps with the help of the Scandinavian crew, who may have felt more loyalty to the younger, more charismatic, if flawed, first mate than to the elderly, hard-nosed captain. He led a mutiny. They murdered Captain Wormell and the few crewmen who remained loyal to him, took control of the ship, and then, after realizing the gravity of what they had done, decided to make a run for it. They gathered their personal belongings, took the valuable navigation equipment to sell, and took the logbooks to cover their tracks and the evidence of their crime. They then abandoned the ship in the lifeboats near the coast of North Carolina, hoping to disappear into the anonymity of the American shore. The thin, reddish-haired man hailing the Cape Fear lightship was likely McClellan himself or one of his chief co-conspirators. The crew milling about on the quarterdeck was the sign that the mutiny had already taken place and the ship's discipline had collapsed. But this theory, as compelling as it is, has major, gaping problems. First, there was the complete lack of physical evidence of a mutiny. No blood, no weapons, no signs of a fight. For 11 men to be killed or subdued on a wooden ship without leaving a single trace is hard to believe. Second, why would a mutinous crew abandon a perfectly sound and extremely valuable ship? The Deering was worth a fortune, as was her cargo. A mutinous crew would be far more likely to sail it to a remote, lawless port and try to sell the vessel and its contents. And third, and most damningly, if they did escape in the lifeboats, where did they go? An extensive search of the entire North Carolina coastline found no trace of the lifeboats or the 11 men. It seemed impossible for that many men to simply vanish without a trace after reaching land. Someone somewhere would have seen something. The second major theory was piracy. This might sound like something from a much earlier century, a tale of Blackbeard and buried treasure. But in the chaotic and lawless years after World War I, piracy had seen a disturbing resurgence on the high seas. The theory was that another vessel, crewed by modern-day pirates, had intercepted the Deering at sea. They boarded the ship, murdered the entire crew, took the valuable equipment and any cash on board, and then set the ship adrift, deliberately sailing it towards the shoals to be destroyed, erasing all evidence of their heinous crime. This theory was given a significant boost when it was discovered that another large American cargo ship, the steamship Hewitt, had also vanished without a trace in the same area at roughly the same time. Could the Hewitt have been a second victim of the same ruthless pirates? Or, in a darker, more intriguing twist, was the Hewitt itself the pirate ship? This theory gained even more traction with the rise of a more specific and politically charged version, Bolshevik pirates. The Red Scare was in full swing in America, and there was a widespread, almost hysterical fear of Russian communists. A prominent Russian-American organization publicly claimed that the Deering was likely captured by Soviet agents operating from a secret mother ship in the Atlantic, as part of a clandestine campaign to disrupt American commerce and steal American goods. The government took this seriously enough to investigate, tasking none other than the young J. Edgar Hoover at the Bureau of Investigation to look into it. But ultimately, they found no concrete evidence to support this international conspiracy. The biggest problem with any piracy theory is the same as the mutiny theory: the profound lack of violence. A pirate attack would likely be a bloody, chaotic, and messy affair. The scene on the Deering was anything but. It was quiet, strangely orderly, and deeply, unnervingly strange. This leads to the third major theory, the one favored by the pragmatists and the insurance adjusters: the awesome and indifferent power of Mother Nature. The crew had, after all, reported losing their anchors in a powerful storm. The graveyard of the Atlantic is known for its sudden, violent hurricanes, which can appear with little warning. The theory here is that the Deering, battered and damaged by a powerful storm and with its steering gear compromised, was in serious, imminent trouble. The crew, believing the ship was about to founder and sink beneath their feet, made the rational, if terrifying, decision to abandon her in the 2 lifeboats. They gathered what they could and rowed away into the storm, hoping to be picked up or to make it to the distant shore. But the Deering, now a derelict, a true ghost ship, didn't sink. Freed of its human crew, she simply sailed on, an automaton of wind and canvas, carried by the powerful currents and gusting winds, until she eventually, inevitably, ran aground on Diamond Shoals. The crew in the 2 small lifeboats, meanwhile, were caught in the open ocean in the same violent storm and were tragically, silently, lost without a trace. This theory neatly explains the missing crew, the missing lifeboats, and the lack of violence on the ship. It's a clean, tragic, and entirely plausible explanation for what happened. But it too has significant flaws. Would a veteran crew, led by an experienced captain like Wormel, abandon a large, structurally sound vessel for 2 small, open lifeboats in the middle of a raging storm? It would be a desperate, last-resort gamble, an almost certain death sentence. It would have to be a storm of truly epic, once-in-a-century proportions to justify it. And the Deering, while battered, did not look like it had been through such a storm. Her 5 masts were still standing. Her sails were still set, not shredded to ribbons as they would be in a hurricane. And again, where were the lifeboats? Even if they capsized, wreckage, oars, and bodies should have eventually washed ashore along the outer banks. None ever did, with all of the logical explanations failing to completely fit the strange and contradictory facts of the case. The public and the press inevitably turned to more speculative, more imaginative, and more supernatural explanations. This is where the Carol A. Deering ceases to be just a maritime mystery and becomes a foundational cornerstone of one of the 20th century's most enduring and popular myths, the Bermuda Triangle. Although the term Bermuda Triangle wouldn't be officially coined for several more decades, the area of the Atlantic stretching from Bermuda to the Florida coast and up to the Carolinas was already gaining a sinister reputation as a place where ships and planes vanished under mysterious and inexplicable circumstances. The shocking disappearance of the massive Navy collier, the USS Cyclops, in 1918 with over 300 souls on board, was still a fresh and shocking memory. The nearly simultaneous disappearance of the Deering and the Hewitt in the same region seemed to be part of a dark and sinister pattern, a suggestion that some malevolent force was at work in these waters. This theory was supercharged by the dramatic discovery of a strange message in a bottle. In the spring of 1921, a bottle washed ashore on the North Carolina coast, discovered by a local man named Christopher Columbus Gray. Inside was a note, purportedly written by a crewman from the lost steamship Hewitt. The note claimed, in frantic, desperate writing, that the Hewitt had been captured by the crew of the Carol A. Deering, who were operating as pirates. Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like a chaser, the note read. Taking off everything, handcuffing crew. Crew hiding all over ship. No chance to make escape. This was an explosive and sensational clue, suggesting a bizarre and violent combination of mutiny and piracy. The FBI investigated the note intensely, but eventually, handwriting analysis proved inconclusive, and the discoverer's own mother claimed it was all a hoax, that her son had written the note himself after finding an empty bottle she had set adrift months earlier. The clue, like all the others in this maddening case, dissolved into ambiguity and doubt. The Bermuda Triangle theory, of course, explains everything and nothing. It posits that some unknown, paranormal, or even extraterrestrial force is at work in the region, a force that can pluck an entire crew from a ship, leaving no trace, a force that defies our laws of physics and our understanding of the world. It's a God of the gaps explanation. The stranger the facts, the more it seems to fit. But it is a theory without a single shred of physical evidence, a ghost story told to explain a ghost ship. The massive, multi-departmental government investigation was officially closed in late 1922. The final report, a document thick with testimony, evidence, and speculation, ultimately concluded that the ship was likely a victim of the hurricane that struck the area, and that the crew was tragically lost at sea after abandoning ship in the lifeboats. But it was a conclusion reached without conviction, an unsatisfying and anticlimactic end to a sensational mystery. It was, in essence, an admission of defeat. They simply could not solve the puzzle. The wreck of the Carol A. Deering sat impaled on Diamond Shoals for months, a silent, skeletal, and famous monument to its own mystery, before it was deemed a hazard to navigation and was dynamited by the Coast Guard, its final secrets blasted to splinters and scattered on the seafloor of the graveyard of the Atlantic. And so, we are left where we began, with a story that has no ending, a voyage that never reached its destination. The tale of the Carol A. Deering is the quintessential American ghost ship mystery. It has all the classic, haunting elements. A majestic vessel at the very end of its era, a troubled and volatile crew, a cryptic final message shouted across the waves, an eerie and contradictory discovery scene, and a complete and total lack of answers. It is a perfect, self-contained, and utterly, eternally unsolvable enigma. It's a story that reminds us of the profound and terrifying power of the ocean, a world that operates on a scale and with a force that can, in an instant, erase all traces of our fragile human endeavors and our even more fragile lives. The Deering stands as a monument to that power, and to the 11 souls whose final, terrifying moments remain a secret, buried forever in the cold, dark, and unforgiving waters of the graveyard of the Atlantic. Hello, and welcome to the uncharted space between the known and the unknown. Settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare to set sail into one of the most haunting and perplexing maritime mysteries of all time. The ocean has always been a place of secrets. It is a vast, powerful, and indifferent wilderness, a realm that covers more than 70% of our planet, yet one we know less about than the surface of the moon. For centuries, it has been the source of our myths, our legends, and our deepest fears. Stories of sea monsters, of ghost ships crewed by the damned, of strange lights beneath the waves. These are the tales we tell ourselves to try and make sense of its terrifying, beautiful emptiness. But sometimes, The truth is far stranger and far more unsettling than any legend. Sometimes the ocean simply takes things. It swallows ships whole, leaving nothing behind but a slick of oil and a question mark. And sometimes, in its most chilling and mysterious moments, it does the opposite. It gives a ship back, but keeps the crew for itself. Imagine this. It's a cold, gray dawn in the winter of 1921. You are a surfman, a member of the United States Coast Guard, patrolling the desolate, windswept beaches of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. This stretch of coastline is known by another, more ominous name: the Graveyard of the Atlantic. It's a treacherous place of shifting sandbars, violent storms, and shallow waters that have claimed thousands of ships and countless lives over the centuries. As the sun begins to rise, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and gray, you see something impossible. Looming out of the mist, stranded hard upon the submerged and deadly Diamond Shoals, is a ship. But this isn't just any ship. This is a monster, a magnificent, five-masted schooner, one of the largest and most modern sailing vessels of its time. Its sails are set, flapping uselessly in the wind, some of them torn to ribbons. It is sitting perfectly upright, seemingly undamaged, as if it had been gently placed there by a giant's hand. But there is something profoundly wrong. There are no distress signals, no flares, no lifeboats being lowered. There is no sign of life whatsoever. The great ship is silent, a ghost against the dawn. For days, the storm-tossed seas are too rough to approach. The Coast Guard can only watch from a distance as this silent sentinel sits on the shoals, a source of growing dread and speculation. When they are finally able to board her, what they find will only deepen the mystery. They find a ship that is eerily, impossibly empty. The crew of 10 men, gone. Vanished. The 2 lifeboats also gone. The captain's personal effects, his navigational equipment, and the ship's logbook all missing. But there are no signs of a struggle, no signs of violence, no signs of piracy. In the ship's galley, they find a meal, prepared but uneaten, still sitting on the stove. And wandering the silent, empty decks, the only living soul on board is a 6-toed cat, mewing pitifully for its lost masters. This is the true story of the Carol A. Deering. It is perhaps America's most famous and most baffling real-life ghost ship mystery. It is a story that sparked a massive, multi-agency government investigation involving the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Department of Justice, and even a young J. Edgar Hoover at the Bureau of Investigation. It is a story filled with tales of mutiny, of piracy, of hurricanes, and even whispers of something far stranger, something connected to the emerging mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. Tonight, we will board the Carol A. Deering. We will piece together the final, fateful voyage of this magnificent ship. We will meet the crew, a collection of seasoned sailors and inexperienced newcomers. We will sift through the scant and often contradictory clues they left behind. And we will explore the myriad theories, from the mundane to the truly bizarre, that have attempted to explain what happened to the 10 men who sailed this ghost ship on its final journey, and who vanished from the face of the earth. So, join me as we cast off into the cold, gray waters of the Atlantic, and confront the chilling, unsolved mystery of the Carol A. Deering. Part 1: The Last Voyage. Chapter 1: A Ship of the New Age. To understand the mystery, we must first understand the ship. The Carol A. Deering was not some ancient, creaking vessel from a bygone era. She was a product of the modern age, a magnificent and powerful piece of maritime technology. She was built in 1919 in Bath, Maine, by the G.G. Deering Company, one of the most respected shipbuilding firms on the East Coast. The company was famous for its large, wooden schooners, the workhorses of America's coastal trade. The Deering was one of their finest creations. She was a 5-masted fore-and-aft schooner, measuring 255 feet in length. Her 5 towering masts of Oregon pine could carry over an acre of canvas sails, making her one of the largest and fastest sailing cargo ships of her time. But she was also something of an anachronism. By 1919, the age of sail was dying. Steam power was rapidly taking over the world's shipping lanes. Steamships were more reliable, less dependent on the whims of the wind, and required smaller crews. The great sailing schooners like the Deering were the last glorious dinosaurs of their kind, built in a brief final boom spurred by the immense demand for shipping during the First World War. She was, in a sense, a ghost ship even before she became only beautiful relic of a passing era. Her final voyage began on August 22, 1920. She sailed from the port of Norfolk, Virginia, under the command of Captain William H. Merritt. Captain Merritt was a respected 66-year-old veteran of the sea. He was a part owner of the ship, along with the Deering family. He was known as a competent and fair-minded commander. He was bringing along his son, Sewell Merritt, as his first mate. The rest of the crew was a mix of seasoned sailors and new hands, a total of 10 men. Their destination was Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Their cargo was a full load of coal. It was a routine voyage, a straightforward journey down the coast of the Americas, across the equator, and into the southern hemisphere. The first leg of the journey seems to have been entirely uneventful. They arrived in Rio, unloaded their coal, and prepared for the return trip. But in Rio, the first hint of trouble emerged. A shadow fell over the voyage. Captain Merritt, for reasons that are not entirely clear, fell ill. He was deemed unfit to command the ship for the return journey. He and his son, the first mate, left the Deering in Brazil and booked passage back to the United States on a steamship. This left the G.G. Deering Company with a serious problem. They had a valuable ship and cargo in a foreign port, thousands of miles from home, with no captain and no first mate. They had to find replacements, and quickly. The man they hired to take command was a 66-year-old retired sea captain named Willis T. Wormel. Wormel was a well-respected veteran with a long and distinguished career. He had been coaxed out of retirement for this one last voyage. The man hired as the new first mate was a 30-year-old named Charles B. McClellan. And here, the character dynamics of our story take a dark and crucial turn. While Captain Wormel was an old-school, respected figure, his new first mate, McClellan, was reportedly a man of a very different character. He was known to be a heavy drinker, and several accounts suggest he held a deep and open animosity towards Captain Wormel. He allegedly felt that he should have been given command of the ship, not this old man brought out of retirement. There was immediate tension between the two most powerful men on board. Furthermore, the original crew, who had signed on to sail with Captain Merritt, were now stuck with a new, unknown captain and a first mate who was rumored to be a troublemaker. The crew itself was a mix of nationalities, mostly Danes, which was common at the time. But reports from Rio suggest they were a difficult and grumbling lot. So, on December 2, 1920, the Carol A. Deering set sail from Rio, bound for Norfolk. Her cargo hold was empty, making her light and fast, but also more vulnerable to the battering of heavy seas. Her command was divided. Her crew was discontented. The ship was sailing under a cloud of bad blood before it even left the harbor. Chapter 2, Whispers on the Water. The journey north from Rio should have taken about 6 to 8 weeks. For the first month, the Carol A. Deering sailed into a complete void. There was no radio on board. Most sailing ships of her size didn't have them yet. She was a silent world, alone on the vast expanse of the Atlantic. The first contact she made was on January 9, 1921. She pulled into the port of Bridgetown, Barbados, for supplies. And it was here, in Barbados, that the signs of serious trouble on board became undeniable. Captain Wormel came ashore and met with a friend, another sea captain named Goodwin. Wormel looked tired and worried. He complained bitterly about his first mate, Charles McClellan. He said McClellan was a drunkard and was constantly undermining his authority in front of the crew. He claimed McClellan was a curse and that he couldn't trust him. Most chillingly, Captain Wormel confessed to his friend that he had to navigate the ship himself, because the first mate was always too drunk or too insubordinate to be trusted with the task. Wormel even stated, ominously, that he couldn't wait to get back to Norfolk so he could get rid of him. He also complained that the crew was lazy and unreliable, and that they wouldn't follow his orders unless the first mate was present. The clear implication was that McClellan had turned the crew against him. While in port, McClellan himself got drunk and belligerent, and was arrested by the local police after getting into a fight. Captain Wormel had to personally bail him out of jail. Before he left Barbados, Wormel was heard to say, "I'll get him. I'll get him in Norfolk." The ship was a floating powder keg of resentment and mistrust. After leaving Barbados, the Deering sailed north again, heading into the final and most dangerous leg of her journey. The east coast of the United States in winter is notorious for its violent storms, known as nor'easters, and the area around Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, is particularly treacherous. This is where the cold Labrador current from the north collides with the warm Gulf Stream from the south, creating a chaotic cauldron of unpredictable weather, dense fogs, and violent storms. The shallow, shifting sandbars known as the Diamond Shoals extend for miles out into the sea, lying in wait for any ship that strays even slightly off course. This is the graveyard of the Atlantic. For 2 weeks, the Deering once again vanished into the silence of the sea. Then, on January 23, 1921, she was hailed by the Cape Lookout lightship, a floating lighthouse anchored off the coast of North Carolina. A lightship was a vital navigational aid, a beacon of safety in these dangerous waters. The man on watch at the lightship was Captain Jacobson. He saw the great 5-masted schooner approaching. He noted that she seemed to be in some trouble, sailing under reduced canvas despite a fair wind. As the Deering sailed past, a man with a reddish beard and a foreign accent, who was definitely not the captain, hailed the lightship through a megaphone. This man, presumably one of the Danish crewmen, shouted that the Deering had lost both of her anchors in a storm off Cape Fear. This was a serious problem. A ship of that size without anchors was incredibly vulnerable. The man asked Captain Jacobson to report their situation to the shipping company when he got a chance. Jacobson noted that the crew seemed to be milling about on the deck, in a way that he described as unusual and undisciplined. They were not at their proper stations. The man at the helm steering the great ship was also not the captain. Jacobson had the distinct and unsettling impression that the officers were not in command of the vessel. He watched as the Deering sailed on, heading north towards the deadly Diamond Shoals, and disappeared into the winter haze. This was the last time anyone is known to have seen her crew alive. Chapter 3: The Ghost on the Shoals. What happened in the 8 days between her sighting at the Cape Lookout lightship and her discovery on the rocks is a complete mystery. We know that this period was marked by a series of violent winter storms that battered the coast. Any ship caught in these storms would have been in a fight for its life. A ship without anchors would have been in mortal peril. Then, at dawn on January 31, 1921, Surfman C.P. Brady, on patrol from the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard Station, saw her, the Carol A. Deering, her sails torn and flapping, was stranded hard and fast on the outer edge of the Diamond Shoals. She was a magnificent and terrifying sight, a silent monument to some unknown catastrophe. The seas were far too rough for the Coast Guard to attempt a rescue or boarding. For 4 long days, they could only watch from the shore as the great ship was relentlessly pounded by the waves. They could see through their telescopes that the ship's lifeboats were gone. They could see no one on deck. The hope that the crew might still be on board, waiting for rescue, began to fade. Finally, on February 4th, the weather broke just enough for a rescue crew to make the treacherous journey out to the shoals. They boarded the ghost ship. The scene they found was one of profound and eerie emptiness. The ship was deserted. The entire crew of 10 men had vanished without a trace. The boarding party conducted a thorough search of the vessel. What they found, and what they didn't find, only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of a battle, no signs of violence. No bloodstains, no bullet holes. This was not a scene of a bloody mutiny. The ship's logbook, the official record of the voyage, was gone. The captain's navigational equipment, his chronometer, his sextant, his charts was also missing. This was a crucial clue. A crew abandoning a ship would have no need for these things. But a captain, or someone intending to navigate another vessel, would take them as a matter of course. The personal belongings of the crew were still in their quarters, largely untouched. But in the captain's cabin, they found a pair of his boots, of different sizes, suggesting that someone had hastily put on the wrong ones. On a chart table, they found a map of the North Carolina coast, but it was a map that Captain Wormel would have had no use for on his journey. It seemed to have been left there by someone else. In the galley, the scene was particularly chilling. A meal of meat and vegetables had been prepared, ready to be cooked on the stove, but it had been abandoned. It was as if the crew had vanished in the middle of preparing their dinner. The ship's rudder was damaged, likely from being pounded on the shoals. But the steering equipment itself was smashed, as if it had been deliberately disabled. The ship's lights were still hanging in the rigging, but they were in the at-anchor position, even though the ship had lost its anchors days before. And then there was the only sign of life. A 6-toed gray cat, thin and hungry, emerged from below decks. It was the ship's mascot, the sole survivor of whatever had befallen the Carol A. Deering. The cat, along with the ship's papers, was all the Coast Guard took from the vessel. The great ship herself was a lost cause. Stuck fast on the Diamond Shoals, she was being slowly broken apart by the relentless waves. A month later, on March 4th, she was deemed a hazard to navigation, and her magnificent hull was dynamited, sending the shattered remains of America's most famous ghost ship to the bottom of the graveyard of the Atlantic. The ship was gone, but the mystery had just begun. Part 2. The Investigation. Chapter 4. The Tangled Web. The disappearance of the crew of the Carol A. Deering was not just a maritime curiosity. It became a national sensation. Newspapers across the country ran sensational headlines about the ghost ship of Diamond Shoals. The story captured the public imagination, and it launched one of the most extensive and baffling government investigations in American history. The investigation was a sprawling, multi-agency effort. It was led by the Department of Commerce, but it also involved the Department of the Treasury, which oversaw the Coast Guard, the Department of the Navy, the Department of Justice, and even a young, ambitious agent named J. Edgar Hoover at what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI. The investigators were faced with a complete lack of physical evidence. The ship was gone. The crew was gone. All they had were a handful of contradictory reports, a few strange clues found on the ship, and a whole lot of questions. The central question was, what happened to the 10 men? Did they abandon ship? Were they taken off the ship? Or were they all dead before the ship even ran aground? The investigators pursued several main lines of inquiry, each one leading down a rabbit hole of speculation and intrigue. Theory 1. Mutiny. This was, from the very beginning, the most compelling and plausible theory. The evidence for serious trouble on board was undeniable. We have the testimony from Captain Wormel in Barbados, complaining bitterly about his first mate, Charles McClellan, and the unruly crew. We have the strange behavior of the crew witnessed by the Cape Lookout lightship, where they seem to be in command of the vessel. The mutiny theory paints a dramatic picture. At some point after leaving the lightship, the long simmering tensions on board finally exploded. Perhaps McClellan, fueled by alcohol and resentment, finally made his move against Captain Wormel. A confrontation could have turned violent. Wormel and any crewman loyal to him might have been killed and their bodies thrown overboard. With the ship now under their control, the mutineers would have faced a new problem. They were wanted men. They couldn't simply sail into Norfolk. Their plan, perhaps, was to abandon the Deering and escape in the lifeboats, hoping to land somewhere on the coast and disappear. This theory explains a lot. It explains why the captain's navigational equipment and the logbook were missing. The mutineers would have taken them to navigate the lifeboats and destroyed the logbook to erase the evidence of their crime. It explains why the crew seemed to be in charge at the lightship. And it explains why the lifeboats were missing. But there are problems with the mutiny theory. The biggest one is the complete lack of violence found on the ship. A mutiny is rarely a clean affair. There should have been signs of a struggle, bloodstains, perhaps even bodies. The boarding party found none. Also, what happened to the mutineers? The 2 lifeboats were never found. If they tried to make it to shore in the violent storms that were raging at the time, they almost certainly would have perished. So, in this scenario, everyone dies anyway, the murdered and the murderers. It's a plausible theory, but it's one that leaves no survivors and no definitive proof. Chapter 5: Pirates, Hurricanes, and Bolsheviks. With the mutiny theory leaving so many questions unanswered, investigators were forced to consider other, more exotic possibilities. Theory 2: Piracy. The idea of pirates attacking a ship off the coast of North Carolina in 1921 sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. The golden age of piracy was long over. But the early 1920s were a strange time. The end of World War I had left a lot of desperate men and surplus military hardware floating around. And, most importantly, Prohibition was just beginning in the United States. This gave rise to a new and incredibly lucrative criminal enterprise: rum running. Smugglers would use fast boats to bring illicit liquor from the Caribbean and Canada to the thirsty American market. Could a group of these modern-day pirates, perhaps mistaking the Deering for a ship carrying valuable cargo or liquor, have attacked her? This theory seems far-fetched, but it gained some traction at the time. The pirates could have murdered the crew, taken anything of value, and then tried to scuttle the ship to hide their crime, perhaps disabling the steering gear before they left. They might have used the Deering's own lifeboats to escape. However, there's no real evidence to support this. The crew's personal belongings were left behind. The ship wasn't carrying any valuable cargo. And again, there were no signs of a violent struggle. The idea of a pirate attack that left no trace of violence seems unlikely. Theory 3: The hurricane. This is the simplest and, in many ways, the most logical explanation. The ship, having lost its anchors, was caught in one of the violent nor'easters that plagued the coast. Battered by monstrous waves and hurricane-force winds, the ship became unmanageable. The rudder was damaged. The crew, fearing the ship was about to break apart and sink, made the desperate decision to abandon her and take their chances in the lifeboats. This scenario explains the missing lifeboats perfectly. It explains the torn sails and the general state of disarray. The crew, in a panic to launch the lifeboats in the middle of a raging storm, would have had no time to save the ship's log or much else. They would have taken only what was essential for survival. But this theory also has holes. Why would an experienced crew abandon a large, sturdy ship that was still afloat to take their chances in two small, open lifeboats in the middle of a hurricane? It was a virtual death sentence. The rule of the sea is to stay with your ship as long as possible. Also, this theory doesn't explain the strange events at the Cape Lookout lightship or why the captain's navigational gear was taken. And it doesn't explain the chillingly calm scene found on board, the meal on the stove, the lack of any major structural damage before she hit the shoals. The ship was abandoned, yes, but it doesn't seem to have been abandoned in a blind panic. Then there was a fourth and even stranger line of inquiry, one that reflected the political paranoia of the time. Theory 4: Bolsheviks. The year 1921 was the height of the first Red Scare in America. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia had taken place just a few years earlier, and there was a widespread hysterical fear of communist agitators and spies. Some officials, including a very vocal wife of one of the Deering Company's partners, became convinced that the ship had been hijacked by Russian communists. The theory went that Bolshevik agents, perhaps embedded in the crew, had seized the ship, murdered the officers, and sailed it to the Soviet Union as a prize. This theory was fueled by the fact that the Deering's last port of call before Rio had been Port of Spain, Trinidad, where another ship, the SS Hewitt, had also recently vanished without a trace. Could they be connected? The Bureau of Investigation under J. Edgar Hoover actually took this theory seriously, investigating known communist sympathizers in the maritime unions. But, like all the other theories, it was pure speculation. There was not a shred of evidence to support it. The idea of Russian spies hijacking a wooden schooner off the American coast and sailing it halfway around the world undetected is simply not credible. Chapter 6: The Message in the Bottle and the Triangle. As the official investigation stalled, the story of the Carol A. Deering entered the realm of folklore. And with folklore comes strange clues and even stranger theories. In the spring of 1921, a message in a bottle washed ashore on the North Carolina coast, not far from where the Deering was found. The note, scrawled in a desperate hand, read, "Deering captured by oil-burning boat something like chaser. Taking off everything. Handcuffing crew. Crew hid in forepeak. Looks like crew will be murdered. Finder please notify headquarters Deering." This seemed to be the breakthrough everyone was looking for. A confession from beyond the grave. A confirmation of the piracy theory. The handwriting was even tentatively identified as that of the ship's engineer, Herbert Bates, by his widow. The Bureau of Investigation launched a full-scale inquiry based on the note. But the bubble soon burst. The bottle was traced back to the company that manufactured it, and they confirmed it hadn't even been made until after the Deering had vanished. The note was a cruel, elaborate hoax, likely perpetrated by a local fisherman who wanted to insert himself into the famous story. With all the rational explanations, mutiny, storm, piracy leading to dead ends, it's no surprise that people began to look for more paranormal or supernatural explanations. And the story of the Carol A. Deering would become a cornerstone of one of the most enduring modern myths, the Bermuda Triangle. In the 1950s and 60s, writers like Vincent Gaddis began to popularize the idea that a specific region of the Atlantic Ocean, roughly bounded by Bermuda, Miami, and Puerto Rico, was a place of mysterious paranormal activity. They compiled lists of ships and planes that had vanished without a trace in this area. The Carol A. Deering fit the narrative perfectly. Although she was found north of the Triangle, her voyage had taken her directly through it, and she was not alone. In the same few weeks of early 1921, several other ships also vanished in the same region. There was the aforementioned SS Hewitt, a steel-hulled steamship that disappeared without a trace. And most famously, there was the USS Cyclops, a massive U.S. Navy collier ship that had vanished with over 300 men on board in 1918, a case that remains the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history not involving combat. Could the fate of the Deering be linked to these other disappearances? Was there some strange, unknown force at work in this part of the ocean? Theories ranged from magnetic anomalies that disrupted compasses to giant rogue waves to time warps and, of course, to alien abduction. The Deering became Exhibit A in the case for the Bermuda Triangle, its empty decks and vanished crew presented as proof of some high strangeness at sea. This theory is, of course, impossible to prove or disprove. It's a matter of belief, not evidence. But its enduring popularity speaks to our deep-seated need to find a grand, mysterious explanation for an event that is otherwise so frustratingly, stubbornly silent. Part 3, The Silent Verdict. Chapter 7, A Cold Case. The massive government investigation into the disappearance of the crew of the Carol A. Deering officially ended in late 1922, with no conclusion. The final report, after months of chasing down leads, interviewing witnesses, and debunking hoaxes, could only state the obvious. The disappearance of the crew of the schooner Carol A. Deering is a complete mystery of the sea. The case was closed. The files were put away. The 10 men Captain Willis Wormel, First Mate Charles McClellan, Engineer Herbert Bates, and the 7 crewmen were officially declared lost at sea. Their families were left with no answers, only a lifetime of grief and unanswered questions. For a century, the mystery has endured. It is a perfect cold case, a story with a tantalizing number of clues, but not a single piece of definitive evidence. Every theory, from the most logical to the most outlandish, eventually crashes against a wall of doubt. If it was a mutiny, where is the evidence of violence? And what became of the mutineers? If it was a storm, why was the ship abandoned when it was still afloat? And why was the scene on board so strangely calm? If it was piracy, what pirates leave the crew's valuables behind and leave no trace of a fight? And if it was the Bermuda Triangle? Well, that is a question that science cannot answer. Perhaps the most likely solution is not a single dramatic event, but a combination of factors. A perfect storm of human conflict and natural fury. Let us imagine one final scenario. The ship, already a hotbed of dissent, is caught in a violent hurricane. The tension between Captain Wormel and his mutinous first mate, McClellan, finally snaps under the immense pressure of the storm. A struggle for command ensues. Perhaps Wormel is incapacitated or killed. McClellan, now in charge, realizes he is in over his head. The ship is damaged. The crew is panicking. He makes the decision to abandon ship. He and the remaining crew pile into the 2 lifeboats, taking the navigational gear and the logbook with them, and launch themselves into the raging sea. In this scenario, they are not fleeing a sinking ship, but a ship that has become a crime scene. But their escape is futile. The lifeboats are no match for the hurricane. They are swamped by the waves, and all hands are lost, their secrets taken with them to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Deering, empty and rudderless, drifts aimlessly until she finds her final resting place on the Diamond Shoals. This composite theory ties together many of the loose ends. It accounts for the tensions on board, the missing equipment, the missing lifeboats, and the ultimate disappearance of the entire crew. It is plausible. It is logical. But it is and will always remain just a theory, a ghost story. The Carol A. Deering has become more than just a historical mystery. It is a symbol of the ocean's power to keep its secrets. It is a testament to the fact that even in our modern world, there are still places where a ship full of men can sail over the horizon and simply vanish, leaving behind nothing but an empty vessel and an eternal, unanswerable question. The ship on the shoals is a silent, magnificent tombstone, not for the men whose bodies were never found, but for the truth itself. Thank you for joining me on this voyage into one of the greatest unsolved ship mysteries of all time. The tale of the Carol A. Deering is a chilling reminder that for all our technology and all our knowledge, the sea remains a vast and mysterious place, and some questions are destined to remain unanswered, lost in the depths. If you found this exploration of this classic ghost ship story compelling, please consider supporting our channel. You can do that by leaving a like, subscribing, and hitting the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the uncharted territories of history and mystery. But most of all, I want to hear from you. What is your theory? What do you believe happened to the crew of the Carol A. Deering? Was it a simple case of mutiny? A desperate abandonment in a storm? Or do you lean towards something stranger? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. We have many more mysteries to explore together, from unsolved crimes to baffling disappearances and strange phenomena that defy easy explanation. Until then, stay curious, keep questioning, and never lose your wonder for the great, unsolved mysteries of our world.